The air smells of warm rye and damp wool. A low fire crackles somewhere behind stone walls, its orange glow barely stretching across the uneven floor. You're in a bakery. Well, a medieval one, which means it's also a bedroom, a grain storage room, and occasionally a hiding spot for chickens who refuse to be reasonable. Outside, it's barely morning. The sky is the pale, hesitant gray of someone rethinking their entire life. You can hear a town crier yawning through his announcements about curfews and taxes. A cart creaks by, its wheels caked with last week's mud and this week's regret. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster clears its throat and decides against it. You're standing in the corner, trying not to breathe too deeply because the smell of yeast is aggressive, not unpleasant, just committed. The baker's shirt sits smudged and wrapped in a too big apron, is muttering to herself something about flour ratios and the judgment of heaven. You don't ask. Now would be a good time to gently remind you, you probably won't make it through this day. You'll either fall asleep, get distracted, or wander off mentally to plan an imaginary life as a traveling candle maker. And that's okay, we're not in a rush. If you enjoy this kind of slow journey through the quietly strange corners of history, feel free to like and subscribe. It lets us know you're still awake, or at least that your device is still playing. And while you're here, drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's oddly comforting to know that somewhere across the world, someone else is drifting off to tales of existential dread. Now, let's ease into tonight's journey. The year is 1347, and you're in the modest market town of Dunstable, England. Population somewhere between County, and everyone knows your secrets. The Black Death hasn't arrived yet, but the rumors are pacing at the gates. People don't talk about it directly, they just bake more loaves, light more candles, and try not to look the clergy in the eye for too long. You're staying with the baker's family, which consists of the baker Marjorie, formidable, her husband John, often damp, and their daughter Joan, suspiciously quiet. The bakery is one of the few places in town with heat in the winter, so people wander in pretending to be lost just to stand near the oven. Today, you're watching Marjorie prepare her morning batch of bread. She's not measuring ingredients with spoons or scales. Of course, she's using something better, a 14th century system of guesswork, muscle memory, and medieval guilt. The church has recently declared that bakers must not shortchange their customers, ever, not even by the weight of a fingernail. If they do, it's considered a sin, a real one, the kind that might show up in your final judgment dossier. So, bakers now add a little extra to every loaf just in case. It's called the baker's down scene 13 for the price of 12. But Marjorie goes further. She quietly believes that each loaf holds a piece of her soul, and if she skips, the devil might notice. You don't ask how that works, you just nod. Outside, the town slowly wakes. A fishmonger dumps a questionable bucket into the canal. A dog begins its lifelong feud with a passing goose. Children chase after something that might be a ball or might be a very round potato. Back in the bakery, the fire hisses, the dough rises, and Marjorie sighs with the weight of flour and afterthoughts. Historians still debate whether bakers like her actually believed the church's warnings, just found comfort in over-preparing. Honestly, probably both. You lean against the wall, warm, slightly flour-dusted, and watching yeast do what yeast do, slowly, silently, steadily growing into something that might just be enough. Later that morning, you're sweeping grain husks off the stone floor when you hear the bell toll. It's not a church bell, it's the sound of a portable handbell, rung by a man who looks like he's permanently angry at the weather. He's the town's Assize officers, and he's here to weigh bread. This is the part where things get serious. Not trial and punishment serious, more like frowny clerk with a wooden scale serious. You follow Marjorie outside, where she places 3 loaves on the portable weighing table. The officers peers at her, like she's just confessed to using oats instead of wheat. He slowly adds metal weights to the opposite side. 1 loaf tips the scale just slightly. Marjorie's lips tighten. She mutters something about wheat shrinkage due to humidity. The officer jots something in his ledger and moves on. Marjorie mutters again. You pretend to examine the clouds, which now resemble smug bureaucrats. Here's the thing about bread in medieval England. It's regulated by law. It's one of the oldest consumer protection efforts in European history. The Assize of bread and ale passed in 1266 set prices and weights for bread. Bakers who fell short could be fined, publicly shamed, or forced to give their bread away for free. For repeat offenses, the punishment was worse. They might be paraded through town with their substandard loaves tied around their necks. Not painful, just humiliating, and slightly yeasty. Marjorie, thankfully, has avoided all that, so far. Back in the bakery, she adds a few more pinches of flour to the next batch. You ask if that will change the texture. She replies, probably not, but the devil counts dust. Joan, her daughter, has been quietly carving something into the wooden bench. You glance over and realize she's sketching a loaf with wings. When you ask why, she replies, bread should be free. You're not sure if she means economically or philosophically, and neither is she. Meanwhile, John the husband is trying to repair the bellows. He claims he once made armor for a knight. Though this story changes every few weeks. Some days he was a squire, some days a falconer. Today, he insists he once fed Richard the Lionheart's horse. You take a moment to sit by the warm stones, letting the heat soak into your back. You listen to the crackling fire, the rhythmic slap of dough, the muffled drum of chickens in the rafters. You're not doing mukbang in medieval terms. You're doing just fine. Today's major historical fact. Medieval England's bakers were monitored more strictly than the local barons. Bread was a daily necessity. If people couldn't afford or trust it, there was panic, and riots, and very angry letters to the abbot. The weird cultural tidbit. Some bakers believed that if their bread burned, it meant a curse had entered their house. Most likely, it was just an even heat distribution from the wood-fired oven. But blaming curses was more satisfying than blaming your own technique. Outside, a distant lute player is practicing the same for notes again and again, unaware that his audience consists solely of a cat and a very old pigeon. Inside, Marjorie dusts off her apron, nods to herself, and starts shaping the dough into loaves again, this time slightly heavier. She mutters, if I'm going to weigh my soul, I might as well use both hands. And you, still sleepy and slightly flour-covered, settle in to see what happens next. Afternoon brings the kind of sunlight that's more gold than warmth, than idle glow spilling through the small window panes, casting long, sleepy beams across the bakery floor. Dust dances in the air, like it's performing for an audience that never applauds. The smell of rising dough has deepened, turning sweeter, heavier. You've now spent several hours in a world governed by flour, fire, and the quiet tyranny of exact weight. Marjorie is kneading her sixth batch of the day, arms dusted to the elbows, forehead glowing with the quiet sheen of dedication and oven heat. Her hands move with the confidence of repetition, like someone who's argued with the same neighbor for 20 years and knows exactly how to win. She pauses briefly to wipe her brow, with the edge of her sleeve leaving a perfect white handprint on her forehead. You don't mention it. No one does. That's the rule here. Don't point out the flower face. Outside, the rhythm of the town has softened. The fishmonger is asleep in his own stall, mouth slightly open like a child dreaming of herring. A pig has escaped someone's backyard and is trotting down the road with a sense of purpose that suggests it's late for a meeting. The bread's first batch has cooled. Marjorie slices one open and hands you a piece. It's warm, soft, and dense in the way only medieval bread can best you enough to make your jaw question your choices, but satisfying in a is might sustain me through a mild famine kind of way. You take a bite. It tastes like hard work, wood smoke, and a vague note of holiness, perhaps due to the sanctified well water Marjorie uses for her dough. She insists it's blessed, though you saw a goose swim in it yesterday. Meanwhile, John is telling Joan a story about a baker in York who once saw a vision of St. Clement in the crust of a barley loaf. According to him, the loaf glowed faintly, smelled of roses, and miraculously sold for twice the usual price. Joan asks if that counts as fraud. John pauses, only if the saint complains. He answers. You finish your bread and wander to the back room, where sacks of flour line the wall like sleepy, overstuffed guards. There's a faint whistling sound. Marjorie's baking song. It's tuneless and strange, but it helps the dough rise. Or so she believes. Today's major historical fact: in medieval England, bread came in multiple varieties depending on your social status. The wealthy ate manchet, bread fine, white, and sifted endlessly. Everyone else got masline, a darker, coarser mix of rye and wheat, often flavored unintentionally with stone fragments from the mill. Today's obscure cultural tidbit: some bakers carved blessing runes into the undersides of their bread to protect against spoilage. These weren't public, more like secret sigils between them and whichever divine entity handled gluten preservation. Historians still debate whether these practices were truly spiritual, practical, or just a good excuse for carving when bored. One theory suggests it was superstition, another says it was branding, a third insists it was just something to do while waiting for dough to rest. Back in the bakery, the sun dips lower, painting everything in peach and copper. Marjorie is humming again. You think it looks like a pillow with legs. You don't say that out loud. The floor creaks as you shift. A chicken clucks in disapproval from its perch in the rafters. You've done very little today, and yet somehow, it feels like you've lived an entire life between firewood, flour, and mild domestic muttering. You lean against the warm stone hearth and let your eyes half close. In this century, doing nothing while bread rises is considered an art form. Evening arrives with a hush. The town quiets down in stages. First the hammering from the smithy stops, then the gossip from the market tapers off, and finally the geese stop yelling at the clouds. You've made it through the day barely. The bakery glows from within, the fire still steady, the oven still warm. Outside, the breeze smells like wet leaves and the faint memory of cabbage stew. You feel it against your face as you help close the wooden shutters, each one groaning like it's also had a long day of pretending not to care. Marjorie places the last round of loaves on the cooling board, standing back with her arms crossed in judgment, not of the bread, of herself. You notice this happens every night, an unspoken ritual, where she decides whether she's good enough to feed a town that rarely says thank you. You ask if she ever gets tired of it. She says, only when the loaves lie to me. You don't press for clarification. Dinner is modest. Stew, bread, some cheese of uncertain age. You sit together near the hearth. The flames pop occasionally, as if trying to join the conversation. John tells a story about a bread fair in Winchester, where a man traded a single loaf for a goat. Marjorie rolls her eyes. Joan looks intrigued. And here's your major historical fact. Bread was sometimes used as a unit of exchange in small towns, especially when coins were scarce or deeply untrustworthy. Bakers could literally pay debts in loaves. Whether that system worked better than modern banking is up for debate. After dinner, Marjorie sets aside a few loaves for a local widow who can't pay. She says nothing about it, just wraps them gently and places them near the door. Joan adds a drawing to the package, a doodle of the moon smiling at a slice of bread. It makes no sense, and it makes perfect sense. The fire burns lower now. Shadows flicker across the walls, like they're replaying the day in puppet form. You hear the distant hoot of an owl, which seems far too judgmental for its own good. Here's today's odd cultural tidbit. In some English villages, it was believed that bread left uncovered overnight would attract ghosts. Not evil ones, just curious ones. Apparently, the smell of yeast was irresistible to the dearly departed, so bakers often tucked their loaves beneath linen cloths, more for spiritual courtesy than hygiene. Historians still debate whether this was superstition or an elaborate method of encouraging children not to sneak late-night snacks. But in this house, every loaf gets covered with quiet reverence. As the flames crackle low and the night cools, Marjorie begins cleaning her tools with the focus of someone who knows the morning will ask for more than she wants to give. Her hands move slowly, wiping flour off the same surfaces she'll flour again tomorrow. You sit there, still, quiet, wrapped in the warmth of a room that smells of effort, tradition, and a little burnt crust. Your eyes grow heavier. Joan offers you a small chunk of hard cheese. You accept it without tasting. Outside, the wind rustles the thatched roof. whispering stories even older than this one. And in the soft silence that follows, you feel it, the deep, quiet rhythm of a world where even bread has a soul to weigh. You wake before the sun, if you can call it waking. You were never really asleep, just suspended somewhere between awareness and crusty dreams about loaf-shaped ghosts. The bakery is dim, lit only by the last glow of last night's fire, and the faint blue of morning indecision peeking under the door. Marjorie is already up, her feet padding softly on the stone floor, as if the house itself might still be sleeping, and she doesn't want to startle it. You notice she's moving slower this morning. Yesterday's flour still clings to the seams of her dress, and her hands are swollen from kneading. She mutters a prayer under her breath, not for strength, but for her back. You sit up from the pallet of wool and straw you've been assigned, brush off a few suspicious crumbs, and rise into the quiet. Joan is still wrapped in a blanket, curled like a comma. John is outside collecting firewood, or possibly just avoiding early responsibility. The bakery feels colder today, as if the oven itself hasn't decided whether to commit. Marjorie sighs, eyes the kindling, and begins the process again. Fire, flour, patience, and whatever small pieces of herself she has left to give. She reaches into a sack of grain and pulls out her measuring scoop, not a standard tool, but a hollowed-out cow horn, darkened with age and memory. It measures nothing perfectly, which, in medieval terms, is kind of the point. Today's major historical fact: most medieval bakers didn't use precise measurements, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't trust them. Baking was more ritual than recipe, more instinct than instrument. If your grandmother whispered to the dough before shaping it, you did the same. And the weird cultural tidbit: some bakers in rural areas believe that flour sifted during thunderstorms would refuse to rise, not because of humidity or static, because the flour got frightened. This theory has not been peer-reviewed. Marjorie stirs the starter, a bubbling mess of old dough, new hopes, and the occasional breadcrumb from last week. She whispers to it, calls it Good Thomas. You make a mental note not to ask questions about that name. John returns with an armful of wet sticks and a complaint about the weather. He says it's going to snow. Marjorie says, of course it is. It's Tuesday. Apparently, meteorology in this house is a combination of sarcasm and historical trauma. You help carry a water bucket in from the back, stepping over a sleepy cat, who you're almost certain didn't live here yesterday. It's been adopted, as all things here are, through silence and passive tolerance. The town begins to stir. A bell rings in the distance, not for a wedding, but for the death of old Edith 3 doors down. She lived to 94, depending on whom you ask, and made the town's best parsnip soup. She also once hit a tax collector with a ladle. People say she went peacefully, dreaming of dinner. Marjorie pauses her kneading to light a small candle for Edith. She doesn't say anything, but the dough seems to rise a little faster that morning. Historians still debate whether small rituals like candle lighting actually influenced the outcome of daily tasks, or if people simply needed to believe they weren't alone in their kitchens. Either way, the flame flickers, and the smell of bread begins to bloom again. You stand by the hearth, wrapped in the weight of a wool blanket that smells vaguely of onion and sleep. Outside, the frost has kissed every surface. Inside, the fire yawns and stretches. And as another day begins in the bakery, you realize that life here is not marked by years, but by love. You search one shaped by the same hands, the same grease, and the same stubborn hope that it will be enough. Late morning brings customers, not many, just enough to remind you that this town exists beyond its oven and its ghosts. The first is a shepherd named Will, who smells like he wrestled a sheep before breakfast and lost. He trades 2 silver coins and a story about a 3-legged lamb for 4 loaves of muslin bread. Marjorie smiles politely. She's heard this story before. She hands him the bread anyway, plus a smaller roll for the road, in case the lamb gets hungry. She says, deadpan. You try not to laugh and fail. Will seems pleased. Next is a widow with a crooked hat and a permanent squint. She buys only 1 loaf, but gives Joan a bundle of dried rosemary as thanks. Joan tucks it into the folds of her apron like a secret. And then comes Father Renth, local priest, known for his oddly shaped shoes and even odder opinions about fish. He doesn't pay for bread. Instead, he blesses the oven. Again, you stand back as he lifts his hands and murmurs a few Latin phrases. Marjorie pretends to nod respectfully, but you catch her rolling her eyes. When he leaves, she says, "That man once baptized a duck." Today's major historical fact: priests and monks were often given free bread by law or tradition, not because of divine rank, but because they were considered essential community services like wells, bridges, and gossip. Weird cultural tidbit: in some regions, bakers believed that bread baked on Sunday would never go stale, but only if the dough was kneaded with your left hand. This was considered a divine loophole, or perhaps just an excuse for laziness. Historians still debate whether these traditions were regionally unique or if they emerged from broader religious symbolism tied to left-handedness and holy days. In any case, Marjorie uses both hands, just to be safe. Outside, the clouds are knitting themselves into something darker. You hear the sky whispering rumors about snow. Don claims he can smell it. Joan says she saw a robin blinking twice at the same window. This, apparently, is a sign. The bakery begins to fill with the scent of rosemary. One's idea. She tucked it near the oven stones. Marjorie doesn't comment, but you catch her sniffing the air with the smallest smile. You help stack loaves on the wooden shelves near the window. Each is marked with a small cross, a precaution against spoilage, curses, and nosy neighbors. Lunch is quiet: more stew, a heel of bread, and a slightly stale apple you pretend to enjoy. Joan draws pictures on the hearth with her finger, flower sketches of animals that only partially resemble animals. You compliment her on the goat. She tells you it's a duck. You sip water from a clay cup. It tastes like minerals, moss, and 700 years of roof leaks. You don't complain. The warmth of the bakery wraps around you like an old story you've heard 100 times but never finished. Outside, the town continues to churn slowly forward, its citizens bound together by fire, flour, and deeply personal weather predictions. And here in the heart of it all, you feel a kind of peace. You didn't expect: a stillness born of repetition and ritual, of loaves that rise even when the world feels like it might not. You glance at the oven. The next batch is almost ready. And your soul, if it's being weighed, feels just slightly lighter than before. Snow arrives with a sigh. Not a blizzard, not a storm, just a quiet, steady softening of the world. A late afternoon. Rooftops were gentle caps, windows frost at the corners, and every cobbled street has turned into a path more whispered than walked. You step outside briefly, and the snowflakes cling to your eyelashes like sleepy moths. Marjorie stands at the bakery door, arms crossed, taking in the weather with the same look. She gives overproofed dough, suspicious, but resigned. It'll melt before it matters, she says. You're not sure if she's talking about the snow or something else entirely. Back inside, the oven is roaring now. It has become more than heat. It's the house's second heart, pumping life into every corner, warming even the sullen chickens above. Joan, wrapped into shawls and a determined attitude, is tending to the dried herbs she's hung near the ceiling. She names each bunch aloud like a spell: sage for stubbornness, thyme for strength, rosemary for remembering. She pauses: an onion skin, because it smells interesting. John is asleep in the corner. He claims he's praying with his eyes closed, but the snoring gives him away. Marjorie is kneading again. Her rhythm is slower today, more thoughtful. She tells you about the time her mother baked during a solar eclipse and claimed the bread tasted like shadow. You're not sure what that means, but you nod wisely. Today's historical fact: in medieval towns, bread ovens were sometimes communal, great stone furnaces used by multiple families, with schedules and disputes and the occasional argument about who burnt whose buns. Dunstable once had one, apparently, but it collapsed during a poorly planned midsummer festival. No one talks about it anymore. The wound is still fresh, especially for the man who tried to roast a duck inside and ended up with a personal fireball. Today's cultural tidbit: some bakers kept a bread charm, a small wooden token carved with a personal symbol or saint, which they'd place on the dough while it rose. They believed it transferred luck, flavor, or divine favor. Marjorie's charm is shaped like a leaf. She never bakes without it. Historians still debate whether such tokens had any real meaning or were simply pieces of folk art, passed down by generations of worried grandmothers. Marjorie just says, "If it works, it works." The light outside dims earlier than expected. Snow muffles every sound. You stand by the window and watch the world disappear into softness. A dog trots by, shaking snow from its fur with theatrical annoyance. A child follows, trying to catch flakes on their tongue. Inside, everything glows. The loaves crack as they cool. The scent of baking blends with pine smoke and wool and history. You close your eyes for a moment and feel yourself drift not asleep, but somewhere between this century and the next. And as the snow deepens, so does the warmth inside this little bakery where bread is more than food, it's memory, ritual, and survival all folded into crust. Evening drapes itself across the town like a worn blanket. The sky turns from ash to ink, and the stars blink awake though they seem half-hearted about it. You can barely see them past the bakery chimney's steady curl of smoke. The last loaves are cooling. The oven is quieting, its temper soothed by a day well spent. Marjorie wipes her hands on her apron and lets out the kind of sigh only earned by feeding a town that rarely says thank you out loud. She leans on the table, eyes distant, and says, "There are days I think bread listens." You wait for the punchline, but it never comes. Joan is playing with a small lump of unused dough, sculpting it into a vaguely cat-shaped blob. She whispers something to it, probably not a recipe. You admire her ability to entertain herself using only flour and imagination. John has woken up and insists he had a vision about a loaf shaped like a swan. Marjorie tells him, kindly but firmly, that he's not allowed near the decorative molds anymore. Dinner is hearty, cabbage, barley, and the good breath one Marjorie only bakes once a week, with a crust so thick it could stop like gossip. Everyone eats slowly, talking less, letting the food and fire do most of the work. You learn that Dunstable has an annual bread blessing festival, though no one quite agrees when it started or what it's for. Some say it honors a saint, others say it commemorates the time the town ran out of salt and survived by sheer stubbornness and root vegetables. Major historical fact: across Europe, towns held seasonal bread festivals, tied to religious or agricultural calendars. They were both practical, distributing surplus grain, and spiritual, thanking divine forces for not smiting the village with mildew. Obscure cultural tidbit: in parts of northern England, bread baked during the full moon was believed to absorb lunar wisdom, though how this manifested is unclear. Some said it helped with memory. Others believed it kept nightmares away, especially if eaten warm, with honey. Historians still debate whether this was rooted in pagan rituals, moon phase farming practices, or just a delightful excuse to eat bread at midnight. All valid reasons. As you clear the table, Joan hands you a slice of her cat-shaped dough. It's slightly overhandled, a little dense, and smells faintly of rosemary and pride. You accept it, with all the solemnity of a royal offering. The wind picks up outside. It whistles past the shutters like a bored spirit. Marjorie shoves another log into the fire and says, "It's a talking one tonight." You ask what it's saying. She shrugs, mostly complaints. The bakery floor is swept. The bread shelves are covered. The dough scraps are given to the chickens. You watch as Marjorie gently sets her bread charm back on the mantel, next to a tiny, soot-covered figurine of Saint Honoratus, patron saint of bakers. His nose has chipped off, but his presence is still felt. You settle into your corner of the bakery, wrapped again in the wool blanket that now carries the scent of everything: flour, and rosemary, and thyme. Joan curls up by the hearth. Jan hums something that may have once been a song. Marjorie sits silently, staring into the fire, tired, just paused. And the snow, patient and gentle, continues to fall, softening rooftops, silencing streets, and blanketing the town in the kind of quiet only bread ovens and small hopes can survive. You don't speak. There's no need. The loaves are done. And for tonight, so are you. The next morning creaks into existence like a wooden door after a long winter. Everything moves a little slower. Marjorie's joints, the firewood, even time itself. The snow hasn't melted. In fact, it's doubled down on its aesthetic choices. The bakery is now a soft fortress, crusted with white, sealed from the world by silence and insulation. You wake to the now familiar sounds, the grind of grain, the hiss of kindling catching fire, the low hum of a woman muttering to her flour. You know the routine, and yet, it feels different today, quieter, somehow heavier, like the town has collectively decided to let this day move at its own sleepy pace. Marjorie is already at it, apron tied, sleeves rolled up, a look in her eyes that could scare yeast into rising. She's making oat loaves this morning, less common, harder to shape, but heartier, for snow days, she says, as if that explains everything. It sort of does. You ask if the snow affects the bread. She smirks, only the baker's, fair enough. Don is, predictably, nowhere to be found. Rumor has it he's checking the roof, which you suspect is code for standing under the eaves and scowling at clouds. John, wrapped in free scarves and what looks suspiciously like a curtain, is doodling bread creatures again, this time with wings. Today's major historical fact: oats were a common backup grain in medieval England, especially in colder months. Wheat was more expensive and sensitive to bad weather, while oats could survive in poor soil, bad moods, and spiritual crises. Obscure cultural tidbit: in some rural areas, people would write prayers directly into the dough using wooden stamps knit for show, but for protection. It was believed that blessings could survive the oven, baked into the crumb. Marjorie's never tried it. She says her handwriting isn't good enough. Historians still debate whether these prayers were mostly religious, folk magic, or just wishful thinking, likely a delicate three-ingredient mix of all three. The fire crackles, the dough rises, the snow continues to fall, softer now, like it's run out of ambition. Marjorie works with steady, practiced hands, but you notice something's humming again, the same strange tune from the other day, off-key but soothing. It's not for show. She probably doesn't even realize she's doing it. You ask what the song is. She pauses. Something my mother sang. Might have been about apples. Or goats. Hard to say. She hums louder, shrugs, and goes back to folding dough like it owes her money. You help fetch water from the barrel in the back. The surface is iced over. You break through with a ladle, and try not to think about how the word refreshing used to mean something pleasant. Joan offers you a piece of oat dough to sculpt. You create a creature. It has ears and possibly feet. She names it Sir Yeast Alet. You nod solemnly. The oven warms again. Marjorie slides in the loaves, dusts off her hands, and sits just for a moment. She doesn't say anything, but you notice the quiet in her bones. And in that moment, you understand that even in a world of repetition, every loaf is different. So is every day. Especially snow ones. It's now mid-morning, and the town is still buried. The usual rhythm bells, carts, street shoutiness muffled under inches of thoughtful white. People aren't visiting the bakery today, but the bread still gets made. That's the rule. Marjorie begins preparing the almond loaves, a rare treat, reserved for holidays, weddings, or in this case, the anniversary of her father's death. He liked almonds, she explains, as if that justifies the luxury. In this town, it does. The almonds are ground by hand with a mortar and pestle the size of a sleeping child. The process is slow and loud. Joan covers her ears. You take over the grinding. It feels like preparing spells. John returns at last, snow-dusted and sheepish, holding what he claims is roof inspection data. It's a small twig. No one asks. Today's major historical fact: almonds were a luxury import in medieval England, often arriving via southern trade routes. They were ground into paste, added to pastries, and mixed into mock milk for fasting days when dairy was prohibited. Weird cultural tidbit: some believed almonds brought clarity of thought, so bakers occasionally gave almond bread to scholars, clerics, or people about to make regrettable romantic decisions. It was considered both a snack and a warning. Historians still debate whether this belief came from ancient medical texts or from someone who just really wanted almonds to mean something. Marjorie's almond loaves are shaped like teardrops for the saints, she says. She dusts them with sugar she's saved for weeks. He was a quiet man, she adds, which in her language means he was kind. You help arrange the loaves near the window, even though no one will pass by today. Joan hangs a bit of dried lavender above them, in case the saints are allergic to almonds, she explains. The bakery is quiet. The fire is warm, for the first time in days. No one is talking. You all sit around the hearth. Marjorie tells a story about her father teaching her to knead dough with one hand because she broke the other falling off a horse. Still made bread better than anyone, she says, even with a crooked wrist. John adds, he once made a loaf in the shape of a chicken, for my birthday. Joan gasps, you never told me that. Marjorie smiles, that's because it looked more like a potato with legs. You sit there, listening to the fire, the laughter, the memory of a man who taught bread and horses and chicken potatoes. You think of how the smell of almonds has suddenly filled the room, and how grief, even in this century, can be shaped into something sweet and warm and briefly, beautifully edible. Outside, the snow continues. Inside, the bakery bakes on. Because that's what it does. It's the day after almond bread, and everything smells faintly of memory. The snow has lightened, not quite melting, but shifting like it's unsure whether to stay or leave. You step outside briefly, and see the faintest trickle of water whittling down the street gutter, trying to remember what rivers used to feel like. Back in the bakery, Marjorie is sharpening her tools. Yes, toast, bread may be soft, but medieval crusts can be a battlefield, and a well-honed blade is essential for slicing, scoring, and asserting dominance over unruly dough. Joan's in a curious mood. She's perched near the window, drawing faces on the glass with her breath. Each foggy shape becomes a character. One is a king, one a pigeon, and one she declares the Duke of slightly burnt crust. Marjorie raises an eyebrow. That Duke still owes me flour. John is polishing spoons, a task no one assigned him, but he approaches it with the solemnity of a knight preparing for battle. Every so often, he holds one up to admire his distorted reflection and sighs, as if recalling a life of glory that may never have happened. Today's project, honey loaves. Golden, dense, slightly sticky, and known across the region as both nourishment and bribe. Good for appeasing neighbors, Marjorie says, and bad moods. Major historical fact, in medieval Europe, honey was the primary sweetener before sugar became common. Honey bread often mixed with spiced wine or lee was considered both a luxury and a medicine. It was given to the sick, the recently Wednesday, and the suspiciously quiet. Obscure cultural tidbit, some bakers believed that if honey was harvested on a cloudy day, the bread would never rise properly. As a result, a few villages had official honeymoon calendars, not romantic ones, just beekeeper ones. Historians still debate whether this belief was practical weather watching or an early form of collective baking anxiety, possibly both. You help stir the honey into the dough, a slow, golden swirl that catches the light like spoon patience. The dough becomes denser, more fragrant, and Joan insists it smells like candlelight. You don't argue. Marjorie shapes the loaves into coils snail bread. Joan calls them and places a single clove in the center of each one, like an edible lie. You ask why, so they know who made them. Marjorie says, there's something different about the air, today softer, warmer. Maybe it's the honey, maybe it's the fact that for once, the bakery is ahead of schedule. Lunch is quiet, a hunk of yesterday's oat bread, dipped in hot broth, shared around the hearth. No one speaks for a while. Even John seems satisfied with his spoon reflections. The loaves bake slowly. Marjorie hums again, this time something closer to a melody. Joan hums along, off-key but confident. You lean against the warm stones and let yourself float for a while. When the honey bread is done, the entire bakery smells like comfort given form. Marjorie sets a few loaves aside for the elderly, the grieving, and one for a boy who lost his dog last week. Honey for the heart, she says. And maybe it's the heat, maybe it's the bread, but something about this day feels whole, not perfect, not exciting, just full in a way that leaves space to breathe. Outside, the snow is fading. Inside, something deeper is rising. By evening, the town begins to move again. The snow-thick hush has given way to hesitant footfalls and cautious commerce. You hear a cart squeak by, its wheels pushing slush into the cobbles. A dog barks at it desperately, just because it can again. Life, it seems, is ready to resume. The bakery door opens and in walks old Fons. a man made entirely of elbows and rumors. He asks if there's any bread with feeling in it. Marjorie, without missing a beat, hands him a honey loaf. That one cried a little, she says. He nods solemnly and leaves behind 3 coins and a small feather, which Joan adds to her growing shrine of stuff that shouldn't be useful but probably is. More customers follow, a mother and child with cold cheeks, a widow with a new walking stick, a boy selling eggs at half price because they've seen things. Each is met with bread, a word, and the kind of silence that means understanding. Marjorie sells steadily, but not hurriedly. Every loaf is placed in hands with care, as if each one might break the spell of the day. You watch this exchange, loaf by loaf, and realize something. This bakery isn't just a business. It's a ritual, a service, a quiet covenant between survival and sweetness. Major historical fact: in smaller towns, bakers were unofficial community anchors responsible not just for bread, but often for distributing news, offering credit, or mediating disputes. Bread wasn't just nourishment, it was diplomacy. Cultural tidbit: some believed that the steam rising from freshly baked bread could carry wishes if you whispered to it at the right moment. Children, in particular, would lean over loaves and make tiny declarations before the crust set. Historians still debate whether this was folklore or a way to keep kids from poking hot bread. Probably both, plus a bit of magic. As the fire lowers, the loaves dwindle, and the bakery returns to quiet. Marjorie leans against the doorframe, arms folded, watching the snow slip away down the gutters. She doesn't smile, but her shoulders relax. Joan asks if they can bake apple tarts tomorrow. Marjorie pretends to sigh but agrees. John starts a story about a royal pastry duel he once judged. Joan interrupts to ask how you duel with pastries. You eat fast and don't cry, he says. Dinner is light: a piece of honey loaf, some cheese, dried apples soaked in warm cider. It tastes like the day felt soft, sweet, quietly earned. You lie near the fire again, blanket up to your chin, the hum of the bakery settling around you like breath. Outside, the town is still recovering. Inside, you're already rising. Like dough, like hope, like something waiting for its turn to be whole. The sun peeks out for the first time in days. Not boldly, more like a cautious guest checking whether it's safe to come in. Its light spills across the cobbles, gilding the snow melt in streaks of gold. The air still bites, but less like a wolf and more like a kitten with opinions. Marjorie is already up, already dusted in flour, already arguing with a sack of grain. It's not a heated argument, more of a firm reminder that it's supposed to cooperate. She says the grain feels moody. You believe her. Today's task is special. Salt bread. Not fancy, not festive, but ceremonial. Salt bread is for apologies, for peace offerings, for restoring what frayed during storms, weather or otherwise. Joan asks who it's for. Marjorie just says, the blacksmith, which, from the way she says it, suggests a history that smells less like romance and more like stubborn disagreements about horseshoes and theology. Major historical fact: salt was not just seasoning, it was currency. Medieval England saw salt as both sacred and strategic. Salted bread was served at major events, baptisms, weddings, treaty signing symbolizing trust and preservation. Obscure cultural tidbit: some believed that if a person refused a piece of salt bread, they were cursed to wander during storms, a superstition strong enough that families would offer it even to enemies, just to be safe. Historians still debate whether this belief originated in Christian ritual, pagan folkways, or the general medieval philosophy of better awkward than haunted. You help prepare the dough, which is tougher than usual. Marjorie kneads it with the intensity of someone working out ancient grievances. Each fold seems to say, you don't get to ruin my good linen again, Thomas. Joan shapes small doughs from leftover scraps, in case the apology needs backup, she says. John appears late, as usual, with a pocket full of borrowed nails and a story about an invisible cat. You stop asking questions long ago. As the salt loaves bake, the smell is sharp, earthy, plain, grounded. Marjorie checks them often, muttering phrases like nut to brown and saints forgive me if it splits. You wonder if the blacksmith will even accept it. You wonder if it matters. You suspect it does. Later, wrapped in wool and carrying a basket with precisely 2 loaves and a tiny dove, Marjorie marches off. She says nothing, just pulls her hood up, and disappears down the thawing lane like a knight off to battle. The bakery is still. Joan sits by the window, drawing steam dragons on the glass. John sharpens a spoon. You sit by the oven, listening to the crackle of cooling loaves, and think about how bread humble, flowery, often underappreciated can carry more meaning than any letter or speech. You think about how sometimes the only real apology is warm and edible. Marjorie returns without a word. She hangs her cloak, stirs the fire, and gets back to kneading. Joan, wisely, doesn't ask how it went. John offers her a slightly bent nail in case you need to fix something emotionally. She takes it with a sigh. You get the feeling that peace was offered. Whether it was accepted is another loaf entirely. The afternoon is for rye bread, denser, darker, and with a taste that lingers like an old story. Marjorie calls it bread for thinkers. Joan calls it scratchy toast. Major historical fact: rye was a staple in Northern Europe. Hardier than wheat and less fussy than barley, rye bread was cheaper, longer lasting, and a favorite among scholars, monks, and anyone without money but with many opinions. Cultural tidbit: some believed that eating too much rye bread made you melancholy, especially if it was baked during certain moon phases. A few physicians even recommended cheerful music be played while kneading it, for balance. Historians still debate whether this was proto-psychology or just the result of extremely dry loaves. Marjorie isn't particularly cheerful while making hers, but she does allow Joan to hum. Today's selection, something suspiciously similar to a drinking song, but slower, and with more sheep references. You help with the baking, flipping the loaves carefully halfway through. Rye cracks loudly when baked too fast. Marjorie says it's like a grudge coming out. John burns his fingers and insists it was worth it. You are not convinced. Lunch is stew, again, but today, it's better. The salt loaves have been sliced and served. Even the tiny dove, which Joan insists tastes regretful but brave. Marjorie doesn't comment, but she eats slowly and closes her eyes between bites. You ask if the blacksmith spoke. She nods, said the crust was good, said nothing else. Joan whispers, he kept the dove. The rye loaves cool. The sun drapes itself across the counter like a cat, and for the first time in days, you all take a moment to do absolutely nothing. No kneading, no selling, no cleaning, just sitting, breathing, letting the warmth of bread and fire do what it always does: soften, hold, remind. Outside, winter stirs, unsure whether to stay. Inside, you realize peace, like dough, isn't fast. It rises slowly, carefully, sometimes with salt, sometimes with silence, and sometimes with just enough rye. The bakery has begun to hum again. Not loud line at the chatter of spring markets or the clang of festival days, but a low, warm hum, like an old melody only the oven remembers. The snow is now a patchwork, clinging to the shadows, retreating from the sun like a shy guest overstaying their welcome. Marjorie wakes with a list. Today is spelled day. You ask what that means. She hands you a broom and says, it means don't fall behind. Spelt flour is trickier than wheat, more brittle, a little moody, much like the people who insist on using it. Marjorie claims it makes a finer crumb, but only if the baker sings to it. Quiet songs, none of that tavern nonsense, she says, throwing a glance at John, who hums in defense. Major historical fact: spelt is an ancient grain, predating even the Romans in some regions. It was favored by certain medieval monasteries for its digestibility and association with health. Hildegard of Bingen, 12th century mystic, composer, and general multitasker, called it the best of grains. Obscure cultural tidbit: some bakers believed spelt could predict personality. If the dough rose too fast, the baker was impatient. Too slow, melancholy. If it didn't rise at all, change careers, Marjorie mutters. Historians still debate whether this was spiritual science or early career counseling via carbohydrates. The dough today is stubborn. It clings to the bowl like it knows better. Marjorie works with it patiently. murmuring reassurances you can't quite hear. She lets Joan add a pinch of lavender, claiming it helps with the flavor and the mood. Joan says it helps keep the dough from being dramatic. You knead slowly, cautiously, like handling a fragile mood. John insists on reading poetry to the loaves. It's questionable poetry. The loaves remain unimpressed. The fire burns gently. The oven, seems cautious yet without urgency, like it respects the grain. Lunch is simple: toasted rye, cheese, and pickled turnips. The turnips are sharp enough to make your eyes water. Marjorie nods approvingly. They're supposed to hurt a little. The spelled loaves rise, eventually, not proudly, but enough. Marjorie doesn't smile, but she says, "That'll do," which in her dialect is equivalent to a standing ovation. As the sun slants across the windows and the scent of lavender bread drifts upward, you realize the bakery feels lighter, not just from the weather but from something unnamed, something softened. You sit for a while after the loaves are done, watching, breathing, listening to the dough rest. Sometimes, it turns out, bread just needs a little quiet to become what it's meant to be. Market day returns, hobbling into town with mud on its boots. The streets are still damp, the air still sharp, but there's movement again: carts rumbling, geese protesting, children shouting half-formed sales pitches that mostly involve tripping over each other. Marjorie preps the stall baskets. Not everything is sold from the bakery. After all, on market days, she brings the bread to the people, like a flour-dusted diplomat with a wicker arsenal. You help load loaves into cloth-lined crates: oat, honey, rye, and the last of the spelt. Joan tucks rosemary sprigs into the corners for luck. Jean insists on carrying the lightest basket and claims it's for security purposes. The walk to the square is short but slippery. Mud greets your boots like an old frenemy. Children dart past, one of them yelling free radishes. Without context, you sidestep a goose. It does not thank you. The bakery stall is modest: a table, a cloth, and Marjorie's stare, which can silence even the noisiest customer. Bread is arranged like treasure rows of golden crusts, dark loaves, spiral buns, and one experimental tart that Joan swears isn't cursed. Major historical fact: market days were more than shopping trips. They were legal, social, and cultural events, often overseen by a reeve or appointed town officers. Bakers had set places, fixed prices, and a long list of rules, most of which Marjorie considers guidelines at best. Obscure cultural tidbit: some towns had bread testers, officials who weighed and tasted random loaves to prevent cheating. If a baker shorted a customer, they could be fined, shamed, or forced to give out free bread wearing a sign that read, "I cheated the loaf." Historians still debate whether these punishments were effective or just entertaining for bystanders. Probably both. The day moves slowly. Customers arrive in waves, some cheerful, some skeptical, some simply looking for warmth. Marjorie sells without charm but with quiet authority. Joan handles the curious. John distracts children with shadow puppets and mild juggling. You hand out Sam Plestany slices with a dab of honey. A boy grins and says, "It tastes like safety." You try not to tear up. Around midday, the reeve strolls by. Marjorie stiffens. He picks up a loaf, sniffs it, and mutters something about acceptable crust ratios. He buys two and leaves without smiling. John bows theatrically. Marjorie rolls her eyes. You hand her a piece of dried apple. She doesn't say thank you, but she eats it immediately. As the sun dips and the wind sharpens, the bread sells up to almost all of it. Joan saves a single oat loaf for the cat. There is no cat, yet. You pack up in silence, bones tired but spirits slightly raised. And as you walk back to the bakery, arms sore, feet muddy, with the scent of sold bread still clinging to your sleeves, you realize something. This little world, made of ovens and loaves and stubborn kindness, may move slowly, but it always rises. The bakery glows with the soft satisfaction of a good market day. Every surface seems a little warmer, as if the memory of coin and conversation has left a faint blush behind. Marjorie sets the empty baskets down like they're full of treasure. In a way, they are just emptied of it. You gather near the hearth again. Joan is carefully tallying coins, although she seems more interested in stacking them into small towers. John claims he met a wandering cheese poet at the market, but offers no proof. Marjorie doesn't ask. Dinner is celebratory by their standards: toasted oat bread rubbed with garlic, thick broth with barley and leeks, and a rare luxuriated figs. Marjorie cuts them with the reverence of someone who knows exactly how many winters they've been saving them. From the bishop's own table, she says, "You suspect this is only a slight exaggeration." Afterward, she makes beer bread, not for tomorrow, just for fun. Major historical fact: beer bread wasn't a novelty in medieval England, it was common. Ale yeast was one of the primary leavening agents. Before commercial yeast existed, bakers and brewers were often closely connected, sometimes sharing yeast starters, customers, and gossip. Obscure cultural tidbit: in some households, it was believed that bread made with morning beer was more cheerful, while bread made with evening beer might encourage hot dreams. There was even a superstition that a loaf baked during a thunderstorm could trap spirits inside it. Historians still debate whether the storm loaf story comes from folk fear, brewer jealousy, or bad fermentation days. You help stir the thick batter like dough, which smells sweet and malty. Joan drops in a few fennel seeds for flavor, and because they look like commas, you nod like that makes perfect sense. Marjorie hums, again low, rhythmic, almost like the bubbling of beer itself. The oven is cooling, so she lets the dough rest overnight. Bread needs dreams too, she says. Anne, apparently inspired, begins telling a tale about a brewer who once tried to invent bread-flavored ale, and how the town banned him for excessive redundancy. Joan giggles. Marjorie pretends not to listen. Later, as you're wrapping up near the embers, you hear soft rain on the roof. Not a storm, just enough to murmur. The kind of rain that makes you want to bake things and not leave the house for 3 days. Joan curls up under her usual pile of wool. John is dancing in a chair, still holding a spoon like a knight's lance. Marjorie runs her hand over the countertop, smooth and scarred from years of flour and fire. You lie down, letting your breath fall into rhythm with the rain, the coals, and the slow rise of the resting loaf. Tonight is quiet and full. You wake to the smell of something bold, yeasty, malty, faintly herby, and slightly burnt just the edges. The beer bread has baked through the night in the slowly cooling oven. Marjorie left it in while the coals were still whispering, trusting old heat and muscle memory. She slices into it as you sit up, and steam curls out like a secret. Breakfast is warm slices slathered with soft cheese and onion jam. Joan declares it the kind of food that could talk a ghost into reincarnation. You agree? Today is slower. No market, no snow, no plans, just the spice loaves. They're rarely made. Spices are expensive to need treasures from faraway ships and sweaty negotiations. But Marjorie has a few tucked away. She says the bakery needs something fragrant today. Something unnecessary, in the best way. Major historical fact: spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and pepper were precious in the medieval world. Imported through Byzantine, Arab, and Venetian trade routes, they were status symbols, medicines, and culinary miracles. A loaf with even a hint of clove could suggest wealth or at least aspirational taste. Obscure cultural tidbit: some bakers would whisper their spice blends to the dough, practice rooted in superstition that flavor could be scared off by loud voices. Recipes were guarded fiercely, sometimes hidden in code or passed only on deathbeds. Historians still debate whether the secrecy was economic survival, magical belief, or just family drama disguised as culinary tradition. Marjorie begins grinding cloves with a small stone mortar. The scent is powerful, filling every corner of the bakery with warmth and warning. Too much, and it numbs the tongue, she says, measuring precisely. Joan preps the tins with butter and breadcrumbs. John reads aloud from an old weather almanac, pausing occasionally to make up parts when the Latin gets tricky. You fold the dough gently, careful not to bruise the spices. It feels heavier, but not in a bad way, like it knows it's special. The loaves go in, and the scent intensifies. It's no longer just a bakery, it's a storybook. Every breath tastes like foreign ports and merchant promises. As they bake, the door creaks open and in walks Mrs. Tamsinth, local healer, gossip distributor, and suspected witch. She smells the air and says, "Cloves, someone's got ambition today." Marjorie gives her a slice and doesn't charge. Some debts are paid in recognition. The spice loaves are darker, softer, with a crust that flakes like bark. They taste like memory and maybe a little like pride. Joan says they taste expensive. Marjorie sets 3 aside for the priest, the midwife, and a little girl who's been sick all week. The rest we eat. You do, slowly, quietly, because this bread wasn't made for haste. And in the soft, spice-scented afternoon, the bakery breathes in time with your heartbeat. Steady, sweet, just enough. Today begins with fog, stubborn, and vaguely damp as if the clouds themselves have decided to descend for breakfast and refuse to leave without coffee. You can't see the bakery from more than 3 paces away. The world beyond the front door might as well be soup. Inside, the air is warmer, thicker with flour, and filled with the whisper slap of dough being folded, stretched, folded again. Marjorie is already deep into barley bread. Her shoulders are squared. Her hands move like they've been baking in fog since the dawn of barley itself. Barley isn't glamorous. It's coarse, underappreciated, and requires more coaxing than wheat. But Marjorie likes it. It's honest, she says, like boots or a decent shovel. Major historical fact: barley was one of the oldest cultivated grains in the British Isles. It fed peasants, monks, soldiers, basically everyone without access to wheat. It was versatile too, often used for bread, porridge, and ale. Obscure cultural tidbit: in some villages, it was believed that barley dough could ward off nightmares if placed under a child's pillow, though it had to be wrapped in cloth first, lest it attract mice or spirits. Historians still debate whether this belief was rooted in pagan ritual, monastic tradition, or simply exhausted parents willing to try anything reasonable. You help grind the grain. It's tough, like working with gravel. Joan hums softly, but even she is subdued today. The fog presses against the windows, turning the glass into a blurred watercolor. John suggests making barley dolls from the scraps, tiny baked figures meant to guard the oven. Marjorie agrees, mostly because the idea makes her laugh. The loaves rise slowly. Barley resists fermentation the way a cat resists baths. But Marjorie waits, and eventually, they puff up just enough. Good enough for saints and tacksmen, she mutters. Lunch is thick slices of yesterday's beer bread, toasted and slathered with sharp mustard and pickled greens. It tastes like survival with a side of zing. When the barley loaves come out of the oven, they're dense, crusty, and quietly proud. Marjorie hands one to a passing shepherd, who appears out of the fog like a damp ghost. He nods once and vanishes. You realize, barley is the bread for days like this. Gray, persistent, and oddly comforting. Evening, the fog begins to lift. Only a little, just enough to see the tips of chimneys and the flicker of lanterns. The bakery lights remain low. The air smells earthy and warm, like barley and hearthstones. Joan names her barley dolls are Crumbly. Don gives his a cape. And you, blanket over your shoulders, sit in the doorway and watch the mist dissolve slowly, quietly, like a story being forgotten. The next morning smells like promise. Not the big no revolutions. No miracles, just small, yeast-scented promises. Warm fingers of sunlight crawl across the flour-dusted floorboards, and you feel a little like a cat in a library, comfortable, slightly out of place, entirely welcome. Marjorie is in a good mood. That means she's only mildly sarcastic and hasn't yet argued with any inanimate objects. Today is for seeing loaves. The big ones, nutty, speckled, a bit unruly. She calls them bread with personality. Joan calls them bread that crunches back. Major historical fact: in a later medieval period, as trade expanded and local farming diversified, bakers began experimenting with seeds like flax, poppy, and fell. These loaves were nutritious, longer lasting, and believed to aid digestion, important in an era when balanced diet meant not entirely made of root vegetables. Obscure cultural tidbit: some people believed that poppy seeds could ward off bad luck if baked into bread and shared in odd numbers. 3 loaves were best. 5. If you were really desperate. Historians still debate if this was mystical or mathematical. Marjorie just calls it a decent excuse to eat more bread. You help mix the dough. It's beautiful, speckled like a painter's palette. The seeds crackle under your fingers. Joan insists each one is a wish. John tries to count them aloud, then gives up at 74 and declares the loaf magical by default. Marjorie adds a swirl of honey and a pinch of caraway. For memory, she says, you shape the loaves carefully. They feel alive, buzzing with texture. The oven, already warm, seems eager today. No crackling protest, just an accepting whoosh of heat. While the bread bakes, you all gather near the hearth. John attempts to play a tune on a wooden whistle. He claims to have whittled himself. The tune is questionable. The whistle splinters. Joan claps anyway. Lunch is light seed bread, goat cheese, and apple slices. Joan insists on dipping her apple in mustard. Marjorie raises an eyebrow. Joan says, I'm building character. The loaves come out golden, dappled, smelling like old forests and new kitchens. Marjorie breaks one open. The crust sings. The crumb is soft. Everyone exhales at once. The bakery fills with a calm you can taste. And as you sit there, chewing warm bread filled with seeds and sun in slow time, you wonder if maybe just maybe this is what contentment feels like. It doesn't shout. It begs. And waits. You wake to a different kind of silence, thicker, warmer, almost smug. The sort of silence that comes after a storm, after a good meal, after the final word in an argument that was never really about what it claimed to be. The air smells faintly of wood smoke and bread crust. You don't know the day yet, but the bakery does. It always does. Marjorie is stirring something in a pot over the fire, slowly, with the patience of someone waiting for history to blink first. Joan is still under her blanket, curled around what appears to be half a rye loaf. John has fallen asleep in a chair. Mid-poem, you suspect the poem was about soup. Today is porridge bread, a bread of thrift, comfort, and texture. Not glamorous, but deeply kind. Major historical fact, porridge bread was common among the working poor. Leftover gruel or cooked grain was added to bread dough to stretch flour and add moisture. It created a dense, soft crumb that lasted longer, ideal in homes without coin or ovens. Obscure cultural tidbit, in some towns, it was believed that porridge bread should never be cut with a knife. Tearing it by hand was said to keep the warmth in. Cutting it could release the spirits of the grain. Historians still debate whether this originated in folklore, famine, or a very clumsy baker. You help stir the pot. The porridge is thick, made with barley and bits of dried pear. Joan sleepily stirs in a spoonful of apple cider. For the ghosts, she says, rubbing her eyes. No one questions this. When added to flour, the porridge turns the dough into something soft and heavy, like a warm blanket. You knead gently. The mixture squishes between your fingers with a soothing, slow resistance. It's like trying to comfort a loaf back into existence. John finally wakes and offers a theory. Porridge bread was invented by accident, after someone dropped their breakfast into the flour and just pretended it was intentional. Like half of history, he says, yawning. Marjorie shapes the dough into round loaves, pressing her thumb into the top of each, to let them breathe. She explains. She adds a dusting of cracked oats. Joan tries to make a smiley face on one. Marjorie lets it pass. The loaves go into the oven like old friends going to nap. Lunch is porridge, of course, slightly salted, with bits of last night's bread toasted and floating on top like little life rafts. It tastes like simplicity and warmth and a day that won't ask too many questions. When the porridge bread is done, the smell is softer than usual milk. Faint fruit. It's not bread you serve guests, it's bread you serve family, or eat alone on a rainy day with your thoughts. Marjorie wraps one loaf in cloth and places it near the window. For the widow across the lane, she says, her son left for war last week. No one speaks for a while. Then Joan asks if she can name the next loaf. Marjorie says yes. Joan names it gentle. Seems about right. It's late afternoon now, and the bakery is quieter than usual. There's no market today, no festival, no particular deadline for anything, just the slow, golden curve of time warming itself by the oven. Marjorie decides on a rare indulgence: milk rolls. Soft, small, barely sweet. The kind of bread that has no ambitions beyond being kind to your teeth. She calls them treat bread. Dawn calls them cloud puffs. Dawn tries to call them a philosophical statement on softness, but is overruled. Major historical fact: enriched breads like milk rolls were more common in wealthier households, where dairy and eggs could be spared. In poorer towns, they were reserved for feast days, weddings, or bribes for priests. Obscure cultural tidbit: in some abbeys, milk rolls were only baked on Fridays. To soften the sins of the week, they were often given to orphans and the very old. The rolls were sometimes shaped like flowers, sheep, or bells depending on the feast. Historians still debate whether the shapes were symbolic or just the result of creative boredom. Marjorie warms the milk carefully, not too hot. She adds a bit of honey and the tiniest sprinkle of dry thyme. For calm dreams, she says. Joan helps with the shaping, her fingers dusted in flour. The dough is silken, more luxurious than usual. You can feel the difference even in the way it stretches. Softer, smoother, slightly proud of itself. John insists on writing a blessing to whisper over the rolls as they bake. Marjorie humors him. You're not sure if the rolls listen, but the kitchen feels warmer anyway. While they bake, Marjorie pulls out a small tin of plum jam she's been saving. It's thick, almost black, with a scent that could silence an argument. She lets it warm near the hearth. When the rolls are done, you don't eat them. You tear them. Soft, pale crust giving way to cloud-like crumb. Still steaming, Marjorie spoons on the plum jam with great ceremony. Everyone takes one. No one speaks for a full minute. It's like eating memory, but the good kind. The kind you forgot was yours. Joan asks if she can have another. Marjorie, with theatrical reluctance, says yes. John declares this his second favorite meal of the year. Marjorie raises an eyebrow. What's the first? John pauses. I haven't had it yet. Outside, the wind has changed. You can smell early spring in the distance, not here yet, but thinking about it. Inside, there's milk bread in your belly, sweetness on your tongue, and nothing urgent left to do. It's enough. The next morning begins with the sound of dripping. Not thunder, not snow collapsing, just the steady tap of melting icicles onto stone. The air has changed warmer now, damp with the scent of wet earth and moss waking up from a long nap. You open the bakery window and the breeze that greets you is bold, curious, and faintly muddy. Marjorie sniffs the air and nods. Time for her bread, she says, like this was always the plan. Our bread isn't about sustenance, it's about memory. Marjorie gathers thyme, sage, a bit of dried marjoram each pinched like a secret. She lets Joan choose one mystery leaf from her box of foraged bits. Joan picks something that smells like lemon and hope. Major historical fact: herbal breads were common in medieval kitchens, especially in rural regions, where flour was stretched and flavor was salvaged from gardens. Herbs were added not just for taste, but for health, protection, and sometimes because someone's cousin swore it made you dream about horses. Obscure cultural tidbit: in some towns, it was believed that if you could identify the herbs in a stranger's bread, you'd be married by year's end. This led to a brief, awkward trend of people sniffing each other's pastries in the street. Historians still debate whether this was matchmaking or just olfactory mischief. You help knead the dough, speckled with green like early spring fields. Marjorie presses each herb into the flour with her thumb, muttering names in it of saints, but of friends long gone, markets long closed, gardens long buried under stone. Joan shapes one loaf like a turtle. No one asks why. John ties herbs together into little bundles and hangs them from the beams. He calls it spiritual garnish. Marjorie calls it dust bait. As the bread bakes, the scent is rich, earthy, warm, a little wild, not floral, not sweet, just real. Munch's cheese, a hard apple, and a few thin slices of yesterday's barley bread. Marjorie adds a chunk of herb bread still warm from the oven. It doesn't need butter. It tastes like forests, like tea without water, like the kind of honesty you can chew. In the afternoon, an old woman stops by the bakery, eyes crinkled, fingers ink-stained. She asks for bread that remembers. Marjorie gives her a small herb loaf, says nothing. The woman nods and slips a tiny pressed flower onto the counter in return. Later, Joan finds it drying near the fire. Looks like yarrow, she says, gently. Marjorie just hums. And as dusk rolls in with violet skies and wet feet, the bakery glows with herbs and something quieter. Gratitude, perhaps, are the first brave stirrings of spring. There's a rhythm to the day's knell. You rise not to alarms, but to the scent of flower in the air, with smoke on your clothes, and the sound of someone already beating dough, like it owes them an apology. Today's experiment, fruit bread, not fruitcake, not the weaponized bricks of Yuletide regret. This is soft, springy, and filled with whatever bits of dried joy Marjorie can scrape from her stores. Dried cherries, a few wrinkled figs, shreds of apple and free raisins that Joan insists have names. Major historical fact, in medieval kitchens, fruit was a treasure, preserved, dried, or stewed. It added sweetness long before sugar became common. Fruit breads were associated with feast days, funerals, or debt forgiveness depending on how good your baker was. Obscure cultural tidbit. Some households believed that adding fruit to dough without naming the loaf was bad luck. A loaf with no name would wander spiritually and cause your next meal to burn. Historians still debate whether this was folklore or a clever way to teach kids not to eat unmarked snacks. You helped soak the fruit in warm cider, watching it plump like stories being rattled. Joan stirs in a pinch of cinnamon and exactly one petal of dried rose. John says it's culinary poetry. Marjorie says it's borderline unnecessary. You're with Joan. The dough is lively, joyful. It squishes and springs, as if it already knows its dessert in disguise. Marjorie adds a swirl of honey before the final rise, and it glistens like the afternoon sky. While it bakes, you all sit near the oven, talking quietly, not about deep things, just things, birds, socks, the goat with a limp. It's the kind of chatter that keeps the walls warm. When the loaves come out, they're golden, bubbling at the edges where fruit escaped. Joan calls one the juicy one and marks it with a clove. Lunch is delayed because you're all still nibbling warm fruit bread with soft cheese and cider. It's too sweet to be humble, too rustic to be proud. Just enough. Later, Marjorie gives a slice to a messenger boy passing by. He says nothing, but bites it before he's 3 steps away. He doesn't stop walking, but he does smile. And in the quiet that follows, Marjorie nods, as if something old just came back into place. Maybe fruit bread doesn't fix the world, but it makes a small corner of it kinder. And tonight, that's plenty. The bakery wakes slowly today. Even Marjorie is quiet, moving like the floorboards might bruise if stepped on too hard. Joan is still asleep under 2 loaves of oat bread she rescued from the cold, and John is whispering something to the fire. Possibly a poem, possibly a complaint about the weather. Hard to tell with John. Today is the starter's day, when you feed the leavening, not the loaves. The wild yeast starter, our mother, as Marjorie calls it, sits in a small jar near the hearth. You're not entirely convinced it's not sentient. She opens the jar and sniffs it like it's a suspicious letter. Then she smiles faintly. Still alive. Major historical fact, before commercial yeast, wild fermentation was the only way to raise bread. Starters were passed down like heirlooms. Some bakers kept them alive for decades, even centuries. Monasteries guarded them like relics. Obscure cultural tidbit. In some households, the starter had a name and a chair at the table during feast days. If the bread failed, people blamed the starter's feelings. It was common to feed it with honey during holidays to keep it cheerful. Historians still debate whether this was proto-microbiology or just very polite superstition. You help Marjorie mix flour and water, gently stirring the bubbly, tangy-smelling concoction. She hums the same tune each time she feeds it, a slow, round melody. Joan says it's the starter's favorite song. You don't question it. John insists on writing a sonnet to the starter to honor its digestive heroism. Marjorie allows it, but only if he doesn't rhyme yeast with feast again. You don't bake much today, just a few quick flatbreads from leftover barley flour and herbs. The rest of the day is maintenance, oiling pans, sifting flour, sharpening the one knife that everyone pretends isn't dangerously dull. Munches flatbread, strong cheese, and roasted garlic. Joan adds dried cherries for intrigue. John tries to swap his garlic for more cherries, but Marjorie blocks the trade with a single glance. The starter sits by the window now, loosely covered, happily bubbling in the afternoon light. You can hear the first bees of the year outside. Just one or two. Scouting, Joan names them. Of course she does. Evening comes with a softness that feels earned. You tidy shelves, fold cloths, and press your palm briefly to the warm brick of the oven. It's not hot anymore, just warm enough to remember what it's done. As you lie down, the scent of wild yeast lingers faintly in the air. A quiet, living thing, working even now. And you drift to sleep, strangely comforted by the knowledge that somewhere on the shelf, something is still rising. You wake to a peculiar sound, singing. Not a hymn, not a lullaby, more like the tune of someone stirring batter too enthusiastically, while trying to remember if they added salt. It's Joan, wearing a cape made of flour sacks, baking honey biscuits. Marjorie walks in, sees the mess, and sighs, if this turns out edible, it's divine intervention. You're roped into helping. The recipe is more instinct than instruction. A scoop of flour, a dash of milk, a heroic amount of honey. The dough is sticky and chaotic, like trying to tame a sweet-tempered bear. Major historical fact: biscuits more like flat scones than modern cookies were staples in medieval homes. Honey was one of the few available sweeteners before sugar arrived in bulk. Biscuits were made for guests, travelers, and occasionally for bribes. Obscure cultural tidbit: some believed that giving honey biscuits to neighbors would ward off envy. Others baked them in shapes of keys or eyes to lock out misfortune or see through lies. Historians still debate whether this was superstition, symbolism, or just creative baking boredom. You shape the dough into uneven little rounds. Joan makes her star-shaped. John molds one into what he claims is a likeness of Marjorie, but it looks more like a startled goat. The oven cooperates. The biscuits brown quickly, edges crisping just before burning. The scent is almost dizzying warmth, sweetness, the echo of fields blooming far away. Marjorie declares them acceptable. Joan beams. Jan offers one to the invisible cat. He insists lives under the bench. You eat the first biscuit slowly, standing in the doorway, letting honey and butter melt on your tongue. Outside, a bird you haven't seen in months lands on the fence post. Joan gasps. Spring's first robin, she says, or an omen, same thing. Lunch is just biscuits and tea. That's it, that's enough. Later, you wrap a few in cloth and leave them on the windowsill of the old potter, who never speaks but always nods, a kind of pastry diplomacy. As dusk falls, you find a small clay dish on your doorstep, shaped like a star. Inside, a single feather and 3 dry petals. Joan calls it a trade. You call it something else. You call it a kind of magic. The sky today is the color of cool dough before it, rice pale, uncertain, a little sullen. There's a hush to the morning, not silence exactly, but the sort of pause that comes before something starts, or ends, or just waits. Marjorie announces, today, we rest the oven. You blink, you wait for the punchline. None comes. Apparently, even ovens have moods, and hers has been giving attitude. As she puts it, crusts too dark, bottoms uneven. It's sulking, she mutters. Let it sulk. So, no baking, but not no work. Instead, flour sorting, grain toasting, and cloth boiling. Joan calls it bread-adjacent chores. Jan calls it a perfect day to begin his epic about a loaf who wanted to be a boat. Marjorie tells him flatly, no one wants to sail in that loaf. Major historical fact: in medieval times, oven maintenance was serious business. Community ovens in villages were cleaned and rested regularly. Ashes were often collected for use in soap or fertilizer. Too much soot, and your bread would taste like an argument. Obscure cultural tidbit: some bakers swore that sweeping the oven in silence would calm its bread spirit. Others left small offerings of salt or flour at the hearth's edge. A few, perhaps just lonely, talked to their ovens like old friends. Historians still debate whether this was animism or just a very relatable relationship with kitchen appliances. You help Joan sift through sacks of flour. She hums as she works, sometimes to the flour itself. You toast millet in a pan until it pops softly, like tiny applause. The smell is nutty, warm, and oddly cheerful. Jan polishes the counter. It doesn't need polishing, but he does it anyway. He says it helps him think, possibly about boats, possibly about biscuits. One can never tell with John. Marjorie boils the baking cloths in lavender water. The scent fills the room. It smells like a bath you don't quite deserve. Joan sighs and says, I want to marry the smell. No one disagrees. Lunch is simple cold seed bread, cheese, and a tart made yesterday with stolen plums. Marjorie doesn't say they were stolen, but Joan definitely climbed a wall. You spend the afternoon tying bundles of dried herbs to hang from the ceiling. John insists on labeling them. He names one courage and another bread's little helper. Marjorie names hers lunch. By evening, the bakery is spotless, quiet, a little smug. The oven hasn't said a word. You sit by the hearth, sipping weak cider, your sleeves still dusted with flour you didn't use. It feels strange not to bake, like hearing the bakery breathe without speaking. But somehow, even in its silence, the oven still holds warmth. And so do you. The oven is in a better mood today. It hums, it crackles, it exhales heat like it's proud to be useful again. Marjorie gives it a quick knock, affection disguised as habit. We're doing crusts today, she announces. You assume this is a metaphor. It is not. Crusts, hard crusts, crisp crusts, the kind that crack when you tear them. Today's doughs are meant to be bold, blistered, and blisteringly beautiful. Nothing soft, Marjorie says, rolling up her sleeves. Let the bread speak. Joan whispers. I think she means scream. Major historical fact, in medieval markets, crust quality was everything. Soft crusts were considered underbaked or lazy. A good crust was evidence of proper fermentation, a strong oven, and a baker who knew their fire like a spouse. Obscure cultural tidbit. Some believed that the sound a crust made when torn could predict the weather. A high, clear crack, dry skies ahead, a dull tear, rain, probably, or bad luck, or both. Historians still debate whether this was early meteorology or just the desperate optimism of soggy townsfolk. You help mix doughs that feel defiant by hydration. Long ferment, coarse flour blends. Marjorie adds extra salt so the crust fights back. She teaches you to score the loaves deep, to give steam somewhere to go and crust a place to form. The oven roars. The loaves go in with a hiss like a knight stepping into a bath. The bakery steams, then smells like heaven's bakery on a busy day. Lunch is crust ends dipped in broth. Joan adds mustard. John adds regret. Marjorie adds silence, and everyone respects it. When the loaves come out, they look like armor. Hard, gleaming, golden brown shields with edges that could start wars. Marjorie thumps one. It echoes like a drum. She grins just a little. You break open a loaf. The crust snaps. The sound rings through the bakery like victory. Joan shouts, sunny skies tomorrow, and throws her arms in the air. Outside, it starts to drizzle. Jan says, well, that proves it. Crusts are liars. You sit by the door, chewing the toughest, flakiest bread you've made all season. Your jaw works. Your eyes water. You smile. Some breads are soft, some kind, and some just remind you you're alive. The wind has returned, not cruel, but certainly opinionated. It howls past the shutters like a bard auditioning for an unpaid tavern gig. The bakery creaks in reply. Marjorie mutters something about air with ideas. You all bundle in tighter today. Scarves, thick socks, 3 aprons. In Joan's case, today's project is travel bread loaves meant to last, to carry, to feed tired feet on long roads. Dense, dry, durable, not for joy, but for need. The kind of bread you pack with apologies and salt. Marjorie calls it provision bread. Joan calls it bread that knows hardship. Jan tries to write a sonnet to it and stops halfway through. It's too stoic, he says. Major historical fact, travel breads like hardtack, black rye, and dense sour loaves were medieval staples for soldiers, merchants, and pilgrims. They were baked dry to resist mold and were often soaked before eating. Flavor was not a priority. Survival was. Obscure cultural tidbit. Some travelers carved symbols or initials into their bread before departure. It was believed this marked the loaf as a guide, a token of home, or even a charm against getting lost. Historians still debate if this was ritual or simply bread-based labeling in the age before luggage tags. You help knead a rye-heavy dough that feels less like baking and more like arm wrestling. Marjorie adds vinegar to extend its shelf life. Joan adds crushed walnuts for morale. John offers a single dried currant to each loaf. Tiny treasure, he says. The loaves are shaped small and flat, with sharp edges and no time for nonsense. Before baking, you score each one with a symbol: a sun, a wave, a spiral. Joan draws a goat. Marjorie, with great restraint, does not comment. As they bake, the air fills with a sharper scent, more earthy than sweet, more ash than sugar. You breathe it in anyway. Not every loaf is for comfort. Munches thin soup, torn pieces of yesterday's crusted bread, and pickled turnips. Joan says, "This soup tastes like traveling." John says, "That's a compliment, might." Joan shrugs. When the travel bread is done, it cools like stone. Marjorie slices one. It resists. She nods approvingly. Each of you wraps a loaf in cloth. Even if you're not going anywhere, the ritual feels right. Because everyone, eventually, is a traveler. Even if only from one day to the next. The bakery is unusually quiet this morning. Not somber, just sour, as if the flour has taken a vow of silence, and the oven is deep in meditation. Today's bread is one of memory. Marjorie calls it remembrance loaf, a rare bake, meant for days when you think more than you speak. She gathers herbs not for taste, but for meaning. Rosemary, lavender, juniper, bread for the people you miss, she says. Joan lights a small beeswax candle near the hearth. Jan takes off his hat. No one knows why. It just feels correct. Major historical fact. Remembrance breads were part of funeral customs in many medieval regions. Loaves were baked and distributed to mourners, often containing symbolic herbs or shaped into rings. Some believed eating the bread helped share the sorrow, easing the weight of grief. Obscure cultural tidbit. In certain towns, the bread was never salted, a symbol that joy had left for a while. Others believed adding crushed sage allowed the dead to find the path home through the scent. Historians still debate whether these customs honored the dead or comforted the living more. You mix the dough with soft hands. The herbs are delicate, and the flour quieter somehow. No slapping, no rushing, just folding in thought. Warmth, done. Marjorie presses a single dried rose petal into the top of each loaf. Joan whispers names as she shapes hers. Jan writes a note and tucks it inside. Marjorie gives him a look, but lets it pass. While the bread bakes, the candle flickers. Lunch is plain. Yesterday's fruit bread, cold tea, and a spoonful of honey. No one says much, but everything feels said. The loaves come out pale, tender, perfumed. You break one open and find it filled with quiet, not sadness, just space. Marjorie places hers on the windowsill. For no one, for everyone. You carry your loaf to the back step and eat it slowly, watching the smoke from someone's fire curl upward like a lazy ribbon. And for a moment, the world pauses with you. Just long enough to remember. The world has thawed. Outside, mud squelches under boots, and the first daring crocus peeks up like it forgot how seasons work. Inside the bakery, the air is light flowery, sure, but with a new smell threaded in, lemon peel and hope. Marjorie declares today a festival prep day, not because there's an official festival, but because Joan insists there should be one. We've earned it, she says, mouthful of honey crust. The bread of the day, spice plated, loaves decorative, fragrant, the sort of bread you bring to a neighbor you haven't spoken to since the goose incident. Major historical fact. Braided breads were common on holy days and community festivals. Spices like cinnamon, ginger, and citrus peel were expensive, but symbolic, meant to honor the day and make bread feel like celebration, not just sustenance. Obscure cultural tidbit. Some regions believed that how tightly you braided your dough would predict the year ahead. Loose braids meant ease. Tight ones meant trouble, and overworked dough meant you'd argue with your in-laws. Historians still debate if this was folklore, superstition, or just bakers judging each other from across the street. Use dried lemon peel into the flour. Joan adds clove with a dramatic flourish. John offers to sing the dough into cheer, but Marjorie suggests he do it internally. The dough is soft, sweet, fragrant, it stretches like laughter, folds like stories. You plait it carefully 3 strands at first, then 4. Joan braids hers into a spiral. Marjorie makes hers long and elegant. John's looks like a broom that gave up. Before baking, you brush them with egg and sprinkle crushed fennel on top. The loaves shine in the oven like braided gold. Lunch is stolen bits of unbaked dough, plus yesterday's hard travel bread softened in broth. Joan insists the broth is blessed. John says it tastes like warm barn. Marjorie says it's just time. When the loaves are done, the whole bakery smells like a small parade just passed through. Sweet, spiced, slightly smoked. You each eat a warm slice with butter and sour cherry preserves. Joan insists it tastes like forgiveness. John cries a little, but blames the fennel. Outside, the wind carries the smell of your loaves down the street. You see 2 curious children, sniffing the air like cartoon mice. Marjorie wraps up a plated loaf and sends you out with it. Go make a neighbor smile, she says, and don't come back without an empty plate. You don't. Sunlight stretches across the floor like a cat that owns the place, which, to be fair, it does. The oven is warm before anyone speaks. You all move slower in it from fatigue, but contentment, the kind that fills the gaps without demanding explanation. Marjorie points to the pantry and says 2 words, pan bread. Simple, flat, folded. Pan bread is the humblest of the humble, the kind of bread that's more gesture than meal. Just flour, water, a bit of fat, maybe herbs, cooked in a pan over fire, not in the grand belly of the oven. Major historical fact, pan bread, or griddle bread, was everyday fare across medieval Europe. It required no oven, no yeast, and little planning. Variations included oatcakes in Scotland, wheat flatbreads in France, and barley rounds in rural England. Obscure cultural tidbit, in some parts of Wales and Ireland, pan bread was folded around small tokens like buttons or coins during spring festivals. Whoever found the charm was said to receive a year of good fortune, or have to host the next feast. Historians still debate whether this was playful tradition or a sneaky way to avoid future cooking duties. You stir flour and water together until it feels like wet clay. Joan adds crushed sage and onion. John tries to fold his into the shape of a badger. Marjorie calmly turns it into a circle. You cook them on an old iron pan, flipping them with a wooden spatula that has seen better centuries. The bread puffs slightly, then settles into golden, blistered comfort. Lunch is hot pan bread folded around fried egg and soft cheese, wrapped in cloth and eaten on the back step. Joan declares it bread you can hold emotions in. John drops a crumb and insists it's an omen. Marjorie swats him with a dish towel. After lunch, the pan is left to cool slowly, still fragrant. You each write something, notes, drawings, silent poems in the backs of old flour sacks, and pin them to the pantry wall. A new ritual, born without discussion. Evening drifts in like honey on toast, slow, thick, golden. You sit by the hearth, chewing the last piece of pan bread, and think today wasn't a day for memory or ceremony. It was a day for bread that stays close. And sometimes, that's exactly enough. Today smells like something's about to bloom. There's a damp warmth in the air, like the earth is stretching after a long nap. Outside, the street puddles glisten under weak sunlight. Inside, the bakery feels like a teapot just before the bull, quiet, but full of potential. Marjorie ties her apron with a kind of ceremony. Today, she says solemnly, we bake for sharing. You assume that's poetic. It isn't. She means literally. Today's loaves are for the people outside this bakery, the neighbors, the children with runny noses, the widow who trades onion peels for crumbs. It's communal bake day. Major historical fact, in many medieval towns, bakers were required to set aside a portion of their loaves for alms given, either mandated by guilds churches, or the haunting sound of someone coughing just outside your window. These loaves were often plain but fresh. Obscure cultural tidbit. In some parishes, a baker who forgot their alms loaf could be bread chained, called out during service, and made to donate double next week. Children would chant cold oven, cold heart at their door. Historians still debate whether this was justice or just petty carbohydrate revenge. You begin with 3 types of dough, one soft, one sturdy, one seeded. Each has its own job: comfort, nourishment, surprise. Marjorie mixes with brisk confidence. Joan hums something resembling a folk song. John whispers to each dough ball, like they're contestants in a friendly tournament. You shape the loaves into small rounds, meant to be held in one hand, torn without thought. No scoring, no garnish, just bread. While they rise, Marjorie assembles little bundles, cloth-wrapped, still warm, tied with string. Each bundle gets a note for whoever's hungriest. Lunch is quiet, just thin soup and ends of yesterday's fruit bread. The room feels full anyway. By afternoon, the bread is ready. You each take a basket and a street. The wind nudges at your knees, and the loaves are still warm through the cloth. You give them to a boy feeding crows, a woman asleep on her doorstep, a tired man carrying tools. No one says much, but almost everyone smiles. You come back with an empty basket and cheeks pink from wind. Marjorie is already washing flour off her elbows. Joan returns with a painted button someone left in her hand. John brought back a folded note that simply says, "Thank you. Your bread remembered my name." You tape it to the wall near the hearth. And the bakery, for once, doesn't smell like effort or ritual. It smells like welcome. The bakery starts the day with laughter or rarity, but not unwelcome. Joan burned her sleeve on the oven and insists it's now blessed. John tried to fix the wobbly bench and somehow made it a musical instrument. Marjorie pretended not to laugh, then laughed anyway. It's a good day for invented bread. No recipe, no name, just whatever the pantry has left. A mystery loaf, improvised, instinctual, probably a little rebellious. Major historical fact: improvised baking was a necessity in many medieval homes. Recipes were fluid, ingredients inconsistent, breads changed based on market luck, weather, and generosity. These loaves were sometimes called fate rounds or baker's gamble. Obscure cultural tidbit: some bakers believed that if your experimental loaf split perfectly down the center, it meant a guest was coming. If it burned at the bottom, you were cursed. If it turned out perfect, you were definitely lying about not having used butter. Historians still debate whether this was folklore or early culinary astrology. You throw together barley flour, the last of the dried pears, some ale, and a pinch of nutmeg. Joan adds caraway because it sounds like a spice that knows secrets. John drops in a handful of roasted oats when no one's looking. The dough is sticky, strange, oddly fragrant. It's like trying to guess someone's life story by shaking their hand. You shape it into one wide, flat round. Marjorie shrugs. We'll see what happens. While it bakes, you write new names for it on slips of paper. Joan votes for bread of coincidence. John likes crumb fate. Marjorie suggests don't do this again bread. Lunch is last night's stew heated in a dented pot, served with a chunk of stale rice softened with cider. It's not fancy, it's delicious. When the mystery loaf comes out, it looks confused but golden. The crust is light, the crumb wild and open. You each tear a bit. It's sweet, sharp, savory, nutty, a little chaotic, a little brilliant. Joan says, it tastes like someone told a story to flour. You all eat with fingers and laughter, and Marjorie doesn't even mind the crumbs. Outside, the sky is stitched with clouds, but soft ones, the kind that make room for light. The bakery, is stitched with something today. Improvisation, curiosity, gratitude, and a quiet agreement that sometimes the best bread is the one no one planned. Morning drips in slowly, like syrup over toast. The bakery feels suspended in a kind of gentle pause. Fire low, the loaves few, the voices hushed without being solemn. Today is not a baking day, not a resting day either. It's a cleaning day. Marjorie says it with such finality, you almost bow. Joan groans. Dawn sighs like a bard whose lute has broken mid-ballad. But cleaning is part of the rhythm here, a sacred ritual of wiping away what no longer needs to stay. Crumbs swept, flour jars sorted, linen folded, walls wiped down until even old soot gives up. Major historical fact: medieval bakeries, even the tiniest ones, were often centers of hygiene, at least compared to the world outside. Clean ovens meant safer bread, and safer bread meant returning customers. Even monasteries had strict rules for washing baking tools and storing grain. Obscure cultural tidbit: in some towns, spring cleaning of a bakery was paired with a bread blessing ritual. Loaves would be stacked on a fresh-washed hearth and sprinkled with water and ash to keep misfortune out of the flour. Yes, it was very damp. Historians still debate whether this was a health practice or just something someone's great aunt invented after a messy Thursday. You scrub pans with vinegar and salt. Joan reorganizes the herb shelf alphabetically, then again by emotional tone. John finds 5 buttons and a marble in the flour bin. Marjorie inspects every corner like it's auditioning for sainthood. By midday, the bakery shines. The brick glows faintly. The wooden spoons seem grateful. Even the oven hums a little, softer, clean, fed, forgiven. Lunch is simple. The last of the fruit bread, now toasted, butter melted into the cracks. Hot tea with too much honey, iffy, wrinkled and perfect. Afterward, you all sit for a long while, not speaking, just letting the warm silence fold around you like clean linen. Outside, the bells from the chapel ring once, then again. Joan whispers, "We should bake tomorrow." Marjorie nods, already imagining the next flower streaked apron, the next batch of rising dough. John starts sketching a new kind of loaf, one shaped like a sleeping fox. He says, no one argues. You lean back against the warm stone wall and exhale. Because that's what bakeries do. They feed, they clean, they begin again. The hearth is cold now, not unfriendly, just finished. Outside, the street is quiet, blanketed in the soft gray hush that arrives before sleep. A candle flickers on the counter, its wax pooling slowly like a sigh drawn out over time. You sit with your back to the oven, warm even in its rest. The air smells faintly of cinnamon, dust, and something sweet you can't quite name. Maybe it's memory, maybe just yeast. The flour bags are tied, the cloths folded. A broom leans by the door like it has stories of its own. The last loaf of the day sits uneaten on the windowsill, cooling in the company of moss and moonlight. You stretch your legs. The bench beneath you creaks in that way only well-worn things do, comfortable, broken in, like the last few notes of a lullaby. The fire's glow fades slowly, not gone, just quieter. And the world outside the bakery seems to hold its breath with you. You think of barley fields whispering in the wind, of hands that mix and knead, of the weight of a good crust, of how a small, warm thing shared with care can change someone's whole day. You think of tomorrow's flour already dreaming in its sack. Let your breath fall slower now. Let your shoulders drop like flour settling in a jar. Let the oven cool. Let the dough rest. Let the baker sleep. Because in the morning, the fire will return, the bread will rise. And so, will you? But not yet. Not now. Now, you rest.